All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's installment of Regional Report, a GPEC Virtual Series. This webcast will be our economic snapshot for 2024, and our panel of experts will be discussing their insights into the current economic forecast for our region, state, and nation. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Eric Sperling with STN. If you are unfamiliar with STN, the Social Television Network, we are an independent media company based right here in downtown Phoenix. All of our shows and segments are dedicated to local leadership, community growth, and actionable solutions. We have done many things over the years with our partners over at GPEC and their CEO, Chris Camacho. We're best known for our community action show. It happens at STN. That is a monthly show taped in front of a live audience of local leaders. So if you are interested in attending one of those events, you can find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. We do have a few seats available for our upcoming show in February. All right, some housekeeping items for today. Today's webinar is being recorded, will be shared on the GPEC website and social media websites. Audience members, you are muted and without video, but you may submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to get to all those questions. So should you experience any technical difficulties, please try logging out, logging back in. That usually fixes this. I'd like to now welcome the President and CEO of Greater Phoenix Economic Council, Chris Camacho, to open up this conversation with his initial thoughts and insights. So Chris, Happy New Year. Here we go, 2024. We'll send it over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and Happy New Year to you and to everybody joining us this morning. Could not be more excited to talk about the current economic conditions, both nationally and here in Metro Phoenix. Thanks to you for your long-term partnership with GPEC as well, Eric, with STN. And also, I look forward to hearing from Nicole and Doug and our hometown talent here, Kristen, Stephenson, talking about the current conditions in our economy. I've spent all morning working on deals and projects that are evaluating the Metro Phoenix market as we continue to move through this industrial super cycle that's really anchored by tremendous semiconductor growth, advanced electronics, electric vehicles, this energy transformation tied to climate tech. But that's been going for the last several years. I think what's a different wrinkle in the last quarter, and probably what I'm most excited about, and I shared this with our executive board yesterday, is we're seeing an office heartbeat once again. We're seeing companies that are once again looking at their office footprint, trying to assess how they amenitize their footprint to support their employee base and getting more of their not only workers back to work, but also looking at growth over the next year or two. So all that being said, I know there's some new inflation numbers that have come out that I'm sure the group will talk about today. But I will tell you that I'm probably more inclined to be confident about the 2024 efforts related to our economy than even where I was 2 quarters ago in the middle part of 2023. So all indications are this region's going to continue to be a robust, innovation-centered growth market. And with 700 or so of our top friends here in Metro Phoenix, we're excited to have you here to learn more, ask questions about the current economic climate and conditions, and let's continue to work together to make Greater Phoenix the top global destination for investment. So thanks for a few moments this morning, Eric. I'll kick it back to you, and we'll go further with the panelists this morning. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, I love what you said there, that you can feel that in-office heartbeat coming back. And I do want to welcome the live audience members who are just joining us. Again, we will be getting to some live Q&A towards the end of the webinar. We do have 3 tremendous speakers joining us today. We'll be hearing from Nicole Cervi. She's an economist at Wells Fargo Corporate and Investment Bank. Doug Walls is with us. He is the Labor Market Information Director for Arizona Office of Economic Opportunity. And Kristen Stephenson. She's the Senior Vice President of Research and Analytics for GPEC. So we're going to begin with Nicole as our first presenter. Nicole, as I mentioned, is an economist with Wells Fargo Corporate and Investment Bank. She's based in Charlotte, North Carolina, but she's from Arizona. She covers the U.S. macroeconomy and assists with quantitative analysis. She also contributes to the group's weekly economic and financial commentary and various reports. So with that introduction, Nicole, thanks for being here. We will send it over to you.
Thanks, Eric. So yes, I'm very excited to be here today. As Eric said, I'm a Phoenix native, so I'm really looking forward to all the comments from the other panelists just to see how much Phoenix has changed. I moved out of the Valley in 2015, so I know that there's been tremendous growth since then. So I'm excited to hear all of your remarks. So today I have prepared for you some macroeconomic data. As Chris mentioned at the top, we actually got some new inflation data, but that didn't actually really materially change some of our forecasts for 2024. So let's go ahead to the next slide and just get a little bit of a look at US economic growth. So this is real GDP growth. You can see here the bars are your compound annualized growth rate, and then you have the year-over-year percent change with the red line. And you can see no matter what transformation that I'm using on the data, real economic activity has been quite robust. So in the third quarter, we had economic output expanding at almost a 5% annualized rate, which is above the run rate that we averaged over the last business cycle. So for all intents and purposes, real economic activity has been quite strong, and that has really come almost at opposition to a lot of what economists were expecting in 2023. If you'll recall, back in 2022, a bunch of banks on the street were starting to call for recessions because we had a very tight monetary policy regime. So let's go on ahead to the next slide here. We can see here that the Federal Reserve, they started hiking their federal funds rate beginning in March of 2022, and they hiked it actually 525 basis points all the way up to 5.5%, where it currently sits today. And so the chart on the right, what that shows you is essentially the change in the federal funds rate over different tightening cycles. So whenever the Fed raises its benchmark rate, we call that the tightening cycle. And you can see the red line square in the middle, that is this tightening cycle that we just experienced over the past few years. And so the only cycles that have the Fed has raised rates as quickly and as highly as they did was the 1980s. And so you might be asking, okay, of course, why is the Fed hiking rates? Why did they hike rates so much? So if we go on to the next slide, well, we really saw across the economy, and we've all felt it in our day-to-day lives, we saw inflation that we haven't seen in a generation. So the chart here is core and headline CPI. That's the chart on the left. That's looking at inflation relative to a year ago. So you can see the headline CPI, which is your total goods and services, the general price level of the economy, that topped out around 9% in the summer of 2022, which was much higher than we've seen in the past few decades. And core CPI, that's a little bit more stable because we exclude food and energy from that to get a better read of the underlying trend in inflation. So you can see that that also topped out above 6%. So since then, though, we have actually seen some market improvement. And this has also come as a surprise, I think, to a lot of economists across the street, because economic growth, as we saw in the first chart, has been pretty strong. And usually when you have strong demand, that can lead to an inflationary pulse, but we actually have seen inflation start to decelerate, which is a good sign. And so some of the drivers, as the chart on the right shows you, some of the drivers that we've seen in terms of inflation slowdown has been related a lot to energy. So in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that led to a big spike in oil prices, which kind of fed through to the US economy. We're actually seeing some of that start to unwind. We've also seen some pressure from the core goods space. So consumer demand in terms of outlays on durable goods, so think like recreational vehicles, sports, things like that, that really exploded coming out of the pandemic when we were all social distancing, but that has actually started to come back a little bit. So we've seen improvement in terms of core goods prices. So that's actually helped a lot in terms of the inflation picture. But last thing that I'll say on this slide is that the inflation goal for a lot of central banks across the world is around 2%. And so we can see that core CPI, it's nearly double. And the new data that we got this morning, core CPI came down to 3.9%. So we're essentially still at 4%. So the Fed, it's made progress towards getting back towards their inflation goal, but we're still almost double there. So let's go on to the next slide. And so this is giving you an outlook in terms of what we expect for inflation. This is a slightly different indicator. This is the personal consumption expenditures deflator. It's just a different read relative to the consumer price index. Similar read here, but looking forward, what we expect at Wells Fargo is we look for core services excluding housing. So that's what some people have been calling your super core. We look for prices there to remain pretty firm. A lot of that is due to prices in the service sector tend to be sticky. So we expect that that'll be a pretty big contribution going ahead. But we look for energy, food, and housing prices as well, specifically rents and shelter. We look for those to kind of decelerate and in some places actually be deflationary. So that'll help inflation get closer down to that 2% goal. And then, so the Fed, going on to the next slide here, the Fed actually has a dual mandate. So one side of their mandate is low and stable prices. So we obviously were not having low and stable prices over the past few years, which is why the Fed was hiking rates so quickly. And their second mandate is maximum employment. So how are we doing on that side? We can see that employment growth has been pretty stable, been solid. You can see that the bars are all positive. So that means that the economy is still adding jobs. We're just adding them at a decelerating rate. But I'll say that the average run rate you can see there, it's closer to 200,000 jobs per month. That's actually what we were averaging in 2019 before the pandemic struck across the nation. So in terms of employment growth, even though we're decelerating, we're actually decelerating back to where we were before the pandemic even happened. So it's kind of just a normalization here. We'd say that for all intents and purposes, we're pretty close to maximum employment. Go on to the next slide. And so what's underpinned some of the deceleration that we've seen in employment growth is that labor demand has actually started to cool off. So you see job openings, they really spiked coming out of the pandemic because we had a lot of job switching, we had really strong demand for services, and a lot of places like restaurants and hotels just did not have the staff to meet that capacity. So we saw a surge in job openings. That's starting to unwind a little bit more recently. It's still pretty elevated, but we've seen actually that labor demand and labor supply are essentially coming back into better balance, which has helped to cool some wage growth. So the chart on the right is average hourly earnings on a year-over-year basis. You can see that that has actually started to slow down, which is a good sign in the eyes of the Fed, because that means that the inflationary pulse from the labor market is starting to cool. So let's go on to the next slide here. So you can see that wage growth, as the previous chart showed, was pretty solid in over the past few years. It's still pretty elevated relative to what it was before in the last business cycle. And so that is actually, from the eyes of the consumer, has been good in that it's helped support labor income, especially. So solid income has supported spending, and you can see this chart is looking at real income and spending on a year-over-year basis. So looking at the growth, and you can see that real disposable income was up 4% in November, which is quite strong. And then consumer spending, it was very strong actually over the summer, and then it started to cool off a little bit in the fourth quarter, but it's still quite elevated at 2.2%. So in terms of the consumer, household consumption and income looks great. So let's go on to the next slide. There's some places where you do feel some type of vulnerability, especially with the consumer. And I've gotten a lot of questions recently. Well, what do you think about consumers tapping their credit cards a lot? Because we know that last year, consumer credit or credit card debt actually surpassed 1 trillion for the first time. So my answer to that is some of that is related to inflation. You know, our wages are going up, and also all the things that we're buying are more expensive. So my revolving consumer credit, which is mostly comprised of credit card debt, of course, is rising more quicker than it was before. And then also, if you look at, let's say, household liabilities as a percent of income, you can actually see that the households are not as levered as they were, especially in the run up to 08. So the household debt to liabilities to income ratio is actually around 100%, which is in line with some of the norms that we saw before the pandemic. So in that context, we can see that households are not necessarily over levered when it comes to their credit spending. And then so if we move on to the next slide, well, if consumers are doing really well, and they have actually driven most of the economic growth that we've seen in the United States, 70% of GDP is personal consumption expenditures, which is essentially consumer spending. What about everyone else? Because we've definitely heard of a lot of sectors that have felt the pain. And so when I think about, okay, what are some interest rate sensitive sectors that have seen activity stall? The first things that come to mind are real estate and manufacturing. So the chart on the right, that just shows you national single family home sales. So this is the sum of existing and new home sales for single family versus mortgage applications. So you can see that both of those series have really trended down pretty much ever since the Fed started hiking the federal funds rate, because mortgage rates, as we know, have skyrocketed. So we've seen a lot of softness in the real estate sector and also in CRE as well across the nation. I know Phoenix is an outlier in that regard because CRE has been quite strong, and same with construction as well. And then in terms of manufacturing, you can see that manufacturing production is actually down on a year-over-year basis, is contracting, which makes sense there too as well. Manufacturers have pulled back on their payrolls. They've been cutting headcount on balance over the past year, and manufacturers, they tend to use debt more extensively than some other businesses. So they've been hit quite a bit by higher interest rates. And so what does this mean for the Fed going forward? Last slide here. we think that the Fed is pretty much done hiking their federal funds rate. And a lot of that is because we've seen a continued improvement in inflation. Employment is still, it's normalizing, it's decelerating, but it's normalizing to a level that the Fed is comfortable with. And we see some weakness in some sectors. So I think the Fed doesn't want to run the risk of over tightening and potentially putting the economy at risk of a recession. So with all of that in mind, we don't think that the Fed will hike rates any further. They've actually held for the past 3 meetings. And so we look for them to actually start cutting in the summer. So that is our federal funds rate forecast there. And you can see that looking ahead, we actually look for, what that means is that in terms of our yield curve and what we look for interest rates, we look for short-term interest rates to come down and the yield curve to flatten over the next few years.
Fantastic, Nicole. Thank you so much. And a reminder, I know we've got quite a large audience watching us live. So if you do have direct questions for Nicole, you can throw those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen there. And then hopefully we'll have time to get to some of those questions at the end. Okay, let's bring in Doug Walls now, the Labor Market Information Director for Arizona Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO. OEO serves as the state's workforce coordinator, providing crucial labor market data, job growth forecasts, and labor trend analyses. Doug manages a team of economists focused on transforming this data into actionable information to support workforce development policy throughout Arizona. Doug, so happy to have you here. Congrats to the Michigan Wolverines, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a good week. So yeah, for my presentation, I'm going to be building off a lot of the themes that Nicole presented in her presentation, but try to give it a focus on Arizona and showing where Arizona has been in order to kind of demonstrate where Arizona can go in 2024 and beyond. So if you want to jump to the next slide, I'm going to primarily just be focusing on answering this question, which is what is the current economic condition in Arizona? And to not bury the lead, I think 2023 can be summed up for Arizona in one word, and that's resiliency. And we've seen that the Arizona economy has shown incredible resiliency and has shown continued growth, albeit some slowing growth in the face of mounting macro level headwinds. And so while we do see some softening, we do see a lot of potential and there is some optimism moving forward. Next slide. So I think I know Nicole touched on this, but I think it's an incredibly important point, and it's been really one of the main data points that's been talked about for the last 2 years. And so Arizona, I think, has shown it's really displayed its biggest display of resiliency by its ability to weather the effects of rising prices for goods and services following the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's also weathered the measures put in place by the Federal Reserve to combat them. And so Nicole touched on the national CPI trends, but in the Phoenix metro area, it recorded a peak CPI growth in August of 2022 when CPI had reached a growth rate of 13%. From the August prior. And at this time, there were concerns about runaway or hyperinflation occurring as a result of the increasing prices. But since that time, prices have steadily declined, while CPI growth is still above its 2% target mandated by the Federal Reserve. It has reached its lowest rate in 2 years, and it continues to trend in the right direction. Next slide. Similar slide, so I won't touch on this too long here, but the slowdown in price increases that we did see for the Phoenix metro area CPI, they are largely attributed to the efforts of the Federal Reserve, who did increase borrowing costs quite dramatically and at a rate not seen since the 1980s. And the consensus at the time was that these rate hikes could potentially stall economic growth at the national level and in Arizona as well, and could potentially even lead to a recession. And while we haven't seen a recession occur, the rate hikes did have an impact on some select industries, particularly those that are more sensitive to the interest rate changes, such as banking and lending. So if you go to the next slide. And just to show why banking and lending did take such a hit, like the federal funds interest rate increase, we did see that the 30-year fixed rate mortgage for the U.S. overall did see dramatic increases following those rate hikes. Next slide. And that did have an impact on the finance and insurance industry here in Arizona, particularly for the Credit Intermediation and Monetary Authority, long name, essentially just borrowing and lending companies. And so we did see a pullback in potential home buyers' abilities to take on those additional costs brought on by the increases in the interest rate. And then we also saw homeowners not necessarily as willing to sell because they were locked into lower interest rates. And so that did have an effect on borrowing and lending in Arizona. Next slide. One of the industries, though, that has shown more resiliency than I think was expected is the construction industry, where after the initial dip following the rate increases, construction has continued to add jobs, and as of November 2023, is up 3.5% or nearly 7,000 jobs from November of last year. Next slide. Just to touch on a couple other housing-related indicators, building permit authorizations have continued to increase, and in September of 2023 reached a local peak not seen in 15 years. And so we do continue to see future building plans and likely more building activity to come in the future. Next slide. Just looking at active homes for sale, we see that the number of days that an active listing is on the market has come down and continues to come down and is below the pre-pandemic average rates for 2019. Another positive sign for the housing industry. Next slide. I also see the number of active listings, while that has come up since 2020 and 2021, it hasn't dramatically increased, and it's still below 2019 levels. Next slide. The one thing I think this is going to, housing affordability is going to be an issue that's going to need to be addressed moving forward. But one thing we didn't see with the rise in interest rates is kind of a deterioration of those prices as we had seen in the 07-08 recession, where we're still seeing some resiliency in the housing. We're still seeing demand for housing despite the high interest rates. Next slide. On the commercial side, this is looking at, this is a national indicator, but it also applies to Arizona. On the commercial and industrial loan side, we have seen a tightening in standards by commercial banks, though again, it didn't reach the tightening standards set back in 07 and 08, and that's come down more recently. Next slide. And we do continue to see loans being generated and actually increasing over the last 2 years to a high. And so this is also a national indicator, but again, all related to Arizona and likely trickling down and showing good signs for Arizona. Next slide. So overall, Arizona's total non-farm employment continues to show positive signs and show job increases. As of November of 2023, Arizona non-farm added 60,000 jobs from November of 2022. And the private sector has added a majority of those, up 47,000 jobs over the year as well. You can see by that chart, we have started to see decelerating job gains, but they still remain positive and have stabilized right around 1.5% to 2% year-over-year growth for the last several months. We continue to see strong growth in a number of industry sectors. We've seen an uptick in hiring in healthcare services, particularly, and more recently, we've seen a increase in government hiring. That was one of the industries that had kind of been pushed aside and was not able to compete with some of the offers from the private sector. the private sector hiring has cooled off a bit, and that did give the opportunity to the government sector to begin hiring and refilling some of the jobs that had been lost during the pandemic. Next slide. On the unemployment side, we have seen the Arizona unemployment rate tick up over the last several months to 4.3% in November, which is a 26-month high. It is still lower than what it had been prior to the pandemic. And a lot of economists would argue that an unemployment rate, below 4%, 3.5%, 3%, is too low and actually causes some issues in terms of wage inflation and competition for a tight labor force. And so while this is something to monitor, seeing the unemployment rate return to pre-pandemic levels would actually likely benefit the state in a number of ways. And so that's as long as we're not seeing the unemployment rate tick up, to continue to tick up, the unemployment rate currently is in a good spot. Next slide. And a lot of the employment success that Arizona has had over the last 10 years can be attributed to the population growth in the state. Arizona's had one of the fastest growing, has been one of the fastest growing states in the nation, ranking 10th among all states from 2010 to 2020 in its population growth. Next slide. And that's led to a strong labor force. And while the labor force in Arizona is tight, we continue to see individuals coming into the labor force looking for those job opportunities and actually finding them here in the state. Arizona ranked third in the nation from 2012 to 2022 in terms of its labor force growth. Next slide. And so what all of this likely means for Arizona is continued growth in the future. We just put out our latest 10-year projections, and we're projecting that Arizona employment will grow at 1.4% annually through 2032. This is a chart showing the difference between Arizona's industry sector percentage change compared to that of the US's. And you can see in every single industry sector, we're projecting Arizona employment to outpace that of the US's. There are a number of factors, and some of those are individual to the industries, but the major overarching theme for Arizona has been that population growth, having the workforce that employers need. And we have seen that translate into new businesses coming into the state and business expansion around the state for existing businesses. So, and that's likely to continue and translate into continued growth moving forward. And then just for those that are interested, we do have a monthly press release for our monthly employment and unemployment numbers, and we'll be also giving a presentation briefing for the short-term employment projections that our office will be putting out later in February.
All right, fantastic, Doug. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Yeah, and just a reminder again, if you have questions for Doug, throw those in at the bottom of your screen there using that Q&A feature. Okay, last but not least, Kristen Stephenson. She will be rounding out this discussion with the economic snapshot of our region. Kristen, familiar face to the regional report, GPEC Senior Vice President of Research and Analytics. She's been with the organization for almost 18 years now. Her leadership is innovative research programs, including community partnerships and market analysis. She supports GPEC's mission of attracting quality businesses and advocating for Greater Phoenix's competitiveness. Okay, Kristen, Happy New Year. Take it away.
Great, thank you. So we'll jump right into this. Wanted to set the stage if we go to the next slide. Starting with, I won't go into GDP a lot since Nicole covered it, but also wanted to really illustrate what we've seen in Greater Phoenix specifically over the last few years. The GDP data for the sub-regional, the sub-state level does lag a little bit with the national economy. So for example, we're looking at 2022 data here, but really wanted to illustrate that we saw tremendous growth in our gross domestic product. Basically post-pandemic. During the pandemic, we actually saw our GDP hold flat, which was not the case for the United States. It dipped a little bit, whereas Greater Phoenix actually saw very, very very mild growth. And then we've continued to see that growth over the next couple of years. For instance, last year, our GDP growth was 4%. So we expect that to continue, tracking the national economy. You saw what happened with the slides that Nicole shared. So we expect to see that continuing, as we get 2023 data into the future. And then if we go to the next slide. But looking at our wage growth, we did see some pressure due to that high inflation rate. So we saw wage growth pretty much, it increased in terms of, nominal dollars, what you would see on your paycheck. But when you factored in inflation, we actually did see a slight decrease in personal income across the board from Greater Phoenix, Arizona, as well as the United States, which was kind of not unexpected due to that inflation growth. Next slide. So getting a little bit into specifically what we're seeing in Greater Phoenix, we have seen our jobs continue to rise. A lot of our story here mirrors what Doug was talking about with the state in terms of the Greater Phoenix region. I would say the Greater Phoenix region has probably actually outperformed most of the rest of the state. So for instance, we saw about almost 44,000 jobs grow year over year here. And amazingly enough, based on what we had lost during that pandemic loss, where we lost, almost 250,000 jobs over a 2-month time frame, over the last 3 years, we have very, very steadily built that back up. You can see that from the chart where it, escalates pretty strongly. And basically, if you drew a straight line from where we were at pre-pandemic to where we're at now, we're right on pace with where we should be. We've actually gained over 400,000 jobs since that drop off in the pandemic. So a lot of strong growth. Obviously, like Doug said, we're seeing it start to modulate a little bit. That would kind of be expected. We were one of the fastest states, one of the fastest regions to recover that post-pandemic employment. So, now we're kind of getting back to those normal trends that we would expect to see. We have seen strong, year over year growth, the construction industry. We've also seen the professional and business services industry continue to be strong, as well as healthcare. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And then finally, we've seen leisure and hospitality come back as well, which was one of the industries most affected by the pandemic. Our unemployment rate is currently at about 3.5%. That's looking at the non-seasonally adjusted numbers. But, as Doug said, what we really want to see is kind of that rate right in that area. You don't necessarily want too low of an unemployment rate. It creates its own problems with too tight of a market. Obviously, we don't want to see a very high unemployment rate like we've seen during, previous recessions. So, we've been kind of comfortably hanging around that 3.5% to 4% for the last number of months. Looking at our current makeup of our industries here, we see that professional and business services continues to be that strong sector. That makes up almost 1 out of every 5 jobs in our economy. The other notable one is the healthcare and social assistance. That's 14% of our economy. The very interesting thing about that one is we have seen tremendous growth in that industry over the last 15 years. So if you look at where we were at, say, pre-Great Recession, we were around 8% of our employment was in healthcare. Now it's up to 14%. So not only has the industry grown, as all of our industries here, it's grown disproportionately faster than all of the other industries. A lot of that is due to the fact that we have a lot of new people here. We've talked about how Greater Phoenix has been a very strong market for new migrants into our market. So obviously we need more doctors, dentists, nurses, etc. So as part of it, we've also seen a lot of growth kind of in the things that don't necessarily have to be here, where we see kind of that innovative healthcare sector, medical tourism, and things like that, where we've really kind of built this strong foundation in our healthcare sector. And accordingly, we've seen it grow to be quite a share of our economy. As I mentioned, leisure and hospitality is about 10% of our economy, and we finally saw that one come back. That industry was decimated by the pandemic, lost about half of its jobs, and it's taken a while to get back to normal, but now we see it where we should. And then the other interesting thing is seeing that construction and manufacturing sectors have become almost even. They're kind of trading back and forth on who is who is the larger industry. A lot of that's due to that manufacturing growth that we've seen here in the market. Some of that growth has kind of slowed back down to more normal levels, but again, these sectors make up about the same components of our economy. And then the last one I want to point out is just that transportation and utilities. It's only 5% of our economy, but we have seen a lot of very strong growth in that sector here. Obviously, during the pandemic, when everybody was ordering things from home, we saw a number of the logistics companies pop up here, especially along our 303 corridor and kind of throughout the whole valley, allowing that access to basically the whole Southwest market. So if we go to the next slide. One of the things that we see, as I mentioned with the transportation and utility sector, we've seen those industrial truck and tractor drivers grow pretty strongly here. We see a lot of, you can see software developers on the list. That has been a fast growing occupation for us over the last few years, actually, not even just this last year. So kind of these industries really match up with what we've been seeing in terms of the growth in industry, which is to be expected. And, like I said, also you can see like the home health on there and registered nurses, things like that. We've continued to see those occupations bolster our economy here, and kind of expect a lot of those same industries and occupations to carry forward into future years as well. Next slide. So there are a number of job forecasts out there. This one is looking at the University of Arizona's Economic and Business Research Center. They do a great job of forecasting the economy and update it quarterly, so I like to always take a look at this one. We're expected to see continued job growth in the greater Phoenix region, even into 2023, 2024. Obviously, as I mentioned, we had recovered all of those jobs lost, but we're expecting to see this to be pretty positive for the next couple of years, even still, 2%, 2.5% growth in our region over the next couple of years, even through what we've seen with some of the shakier economic statistics. We're still expecting to see greater Phoenix to kind of float along top of that. I think even if the U.S. economy starts to downturn, given the structural changes that we have made to the greater Phoenix economy, positions us much better to absorb any of that and continue to at least see not the growth that we saw over the last couple of years, but a more moderate paced growth going forward. Next slide. So talking about inflation, I won't hammer this home too much because the last two panelists have talked about it. But one thing I want to note, Doug had pointed out where we got to a 13% inflation rate here in greater Phoenix. The national economy peaked at around 9%. So we were exceeding that. A lot of that was driven by housing and things like that. But the interesting thing is we've fallen off faster than the US. So last month, well, the greater Phoenix data is released every other month. So the last reporting period, which would have been October, we saw that our inflation rate was 2.9%. It fell below the US's inflation rate for the first time in about 2 years. We saw new numbers. They're not on the slide because they were released about 2 hours ago. We saw new numbers come out this morning that we had a 2.7% year-over-year growth in inflation, which the CPI nationally came in at 3.4, which means we are the second month in a row where we have reported inflation rates below the US average. This doesn't mean that prices aren't still growing. It's just that they're modulating and growing more at the rate that we would hope that they continue to grow. And obviously, as Nicole mentioned, the Fed has their target rate they want to get down to with that core CPI. So we still have a little bit of ways to go on that, but we're getting closer to where we should be. And the great thing for us in Greater Phoenix is that is starting to match the national economy instead of our economy being driven harder by inflation than the US. Next slide. So talking about what's driving some of that, we look at the cost of living index. So what this measures is the US cost is set at an index of 100. Greater Phoenix, as you can see, is at 1.7. That means we're about 1.5% above the national average in terms of cost. So what you need to remember with this is This sets the national average, whatever the national average happens to be. So if the national average goes up and Greater Phoenix doesn't, we'll see our cost of living go down, and then vice versa. So what we're seeing is that we have pretty much increased about the same as the national average, slightly higher. Where we're seeing some good things for us is in our utility sector, our miscellaneous goods, and our healthcare actually run quite a bit below the national rate, especially in the healthcare sector and miscellaneous goods. Those are almost 10% lower than the national cost. But the housing is what's really driving us. You can see that's 12% higher. With some of the more recent cost of living indexes that came out before this one, that number was running closer to 120, 125, so 20 to 25% higher than the US. So we're starting to see our home prices, well, still up a little, getting a little bit more in line with what we've seen on the national side. And then if we go to the next slide. So housing prices, as I mentioned, you can see where they ran up. We actually peaked in June of 2022. So this looks at what our cost was in January of 2000 and then benchmarks it accordingly. So the Case-Shiller index actually got up to 343 in 2022, which was a 26% year-over-year price increase. We did see that drop off. It kind of bottomed out in the January, February time period. And now we've seen a year-over-year change of, this is the first month where it's flipped around. For the last few months since that high reading, we saw decreases in price. Now our year-over-year change compared to October of last year is just right at about 1%. So essentially flat. And then if we go to my final slide, talking about housing affordability, this has obviously had an impact on our housing affordability here. For a number of years, we were running in the 60 to 70% range on our housing affordability. That dropped off very quickly. We actually saw it reach as low as sub 20%. So this is looking at, median home price versus what a household would be able to afford. You can see median income of $99,000, and as of right now, we see that number is around 25%. We're slightly lower than the US in this regard, but we are doing better than a lot of our competitor markets. I think the LA area with the most recent numbers was around 3 to 5% have an affordable home. So, something that we definitely need to keep an eye on, something that as a market we need to address, but, something that kind of brings us in line with our peers. So I believe that's my final slide. So I'll turn it back to you.
Well, fantastic. And as we get into the moderated Q&A here, we've got the live questions coming in. And Chris, I'm going to have you hang on for just a second because one of the questions coming in was in direct correlation to what you were talking about. Could you describe social assistance as part of your healthcare sector? It's not all doctors and nurses. So what's the breakdown when we're talking about social assistance?
So social assistance will be kind of like those housing assistance programs and basically kind of the services that are associated with healthcare, but not healthcare directly. So kind of those programs that help people out, housing, benefits and things like that.
Got it. Okay, let's bring Nicole and Doug back in as these questions keep coming in. And again, apologies as I read some of these cold, but let's start, Nicole, with you. The snapshot looks generally positive, but it seems like sentiment from consumers can be all over the place. So do you have any insight on that?
Yes, that's a great question. And I totally agree. So it felt like in past cycles that you seem to have a strong correlation between consumer spending and consumer confidence, but we've seen that relationship kind of unwind over the past few years. So essentially what we've seen is that confidence it fell quite starkly coming out during the pandemic. Coming out of the pandemic, it came back up, but then once inflation ramped up, a lot of consumers did not feel great about that. And we've seen confidence kind of oscillating sideways over the past year or so. But at that same time, we've actually seen consumer spending grow pretty strongly. So the relationship there has it's not a perfect one-for-one anymore. So I do agree that consumers are more pessimistic on the outlook, although that has not really shown up in terms of their real spending. So I would say that in terms of what I maybe am looking for in this next year is that consumer confidence, inflation is still pretty elevated, especially relative to what we were used to before the pandemic. So we might actually see some of that relationship between consumer confidence being a flat line, essentially actually come to terms in terms of what we see in consumer spending. We look for some moderation in the growth of consumer spending this year.
Fantastic. Thank you. Doug, question for you here. Being an election year, and I guess this is for all the panelists too, what economic issues does this group anticipate being the biggest here in Arizona?
Well, I think, I mean, from all three of our presentations, you know, you can take away the inflation, CPI, and the interest rates. I think that is going to continue to be one of the major economic indicators that individuals, economists, businesses will be tracking, really as just try to get some insight into what the Federal Reserve might be doing or thinking in terms of their interest rate hikes. So I think that'll continue to be one of the major talking points. And as Nicole had been mentioning with you know, inflation and its relationship to sentiment, I think with inflation, it hits everybody too, right? You see it at the grocery stores, you see it every day when you're out with prices increasing, and that does take a toll on individuals and how they're interpreting the health of the economy. It's how much money is coming out of my pocket, and I think that's going to continue through 2024 to be a big theme and something that consumers will be thinking about.
Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I think we'll also see people continuing to look at those jobs numbers that come out every month. Because of the relationship between inflation, consumer spending, and all that. You know, that's where the Fed was trying to kind of thread that needle of how do we raise rates to modulate interest rates without destroying employment. So far, that balance has seemed to work out, and I think people are looking to see if that continues into the new year as well.
Yeah. Chris mentioned at the top here, you know, the in-office heartbeat. And so, Kristen, question for you here. What is the state of offices in downtown Phoenix? Do we have any data on vacancies, return to office rates, anything like that?
Yeah, so a lot of what we've seen in the office market is a flight to quality, where people are taking advantage of what's been going on in the office market to be able to, you know, if they're going into space, they're going into that Class A, highly amenitized space because they can afford to now. So, and you've seen the rates continue in those sectors. So that's where we've seen a lot of the office growth. I think overall, like Chris said, there's a little bit of a heartbeat kind of throughout the whole region, but some areas need more work than others. And so, you know, I think where we've really seen that growth is in those, you know, developments like the Grove and things like that, where it's that amenitized Class A office and maybe less so in some of that B space. We've yet to see that come back. I think just from a personal perspective, I definitely see more activity, you know, down here when I'm driving down for my commute, I'm dealing with more cars. So obviously we are starting to see some of that return to office happen. The interesting thing though here is during the pandemic, we were actually a hotbed of remote working. So, you know, obviously we've got to see how that plays out as well. A lot of people moved here so they could remote work because we have such a great environment for that. So we'll have to see how that plays out over the next couple of years too.
Yep. Nicole, you know, you were touching on credit cards and consumer debt there, and you did go into this a little bit, but a question coming in: how will high levels of consumer debt impact the national economy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I agree. Debt is definitely elevated. It's the highest that it's ever been. But some of that is related to inflation. And when you put household liabilities, for instance, in context of their annual disposable income, the debt appears manageable at the moment, but that, you know, that could certainly change. So the way that I see debt, especially on the household side affecting the national economy, is we've seen delinquency rates actually start to rise, especially they're concentrated more so in auto and credit cards. So if those continue to rise, you might actually see a sharper pullback in consumer spending than we're looking for right now. We look for consumer spending to moderate, but not completely tank. But if you do have a rise in delinquency rates, that could lead to a sharper pullback in consumer spending, which would kind of start that vicious vicious cycle of employment losses once there's lesser demand, and then maybe push the economy into a recession. I think that's one of the question marks for a lot of economists on the street. And as Kristen said, the Fed is kind of is threading this needle, but it feels like the needle is very, very small.
Okay. Question, I guess, for Doug and Kristen here. You guys were breaking down industries, so let's look ahead to the next 5-10 years. Doug, we'll start with you here. What industries does Phoenix hope to attract the most investment from?
I mean, I think for the state and the Phoenix surrounding area, at least more recently, we've had tremendous investment in the semiconductor manufacturing sector. And I think Arizona has positioned itself to be a manufacturing semiconductor hub. And we have seen some of those start to develop. And actually in our 10-year projections, we saw elevated projected growth in manufacturing as a result of some of the planned expansions into the state. And so that's an industry that has global impact, continue to have I think be a major theme throughout the next 10 years.
Yeah, Kristen, same question there.
Yeah, definitely agreeing with Doug on the semiconductor industry. I mean, we've seen since TSMC located, GPEC's seen 30 projects in its pipeline land. And the great thing about this is it's really affected the entire region. It hasn't just been where TSMC is. The supply chain has gone, all throughout the region. You see Surprise, Glendale, Scottsdale, Casa Grande, all throughout. And then, along with that, we also see Intel's working on their current expansion too. So we've got, large cranes bookending both ends of the valley in the semiconductor industry. And I think we've still got some runway on that, especially, with some of these federal programs like the CHIPS Act ongoing right now. The other one too that I think we'll see strong growth is, I mentioned the healthcare sector, but really in the med tech industry, we were awarded one of the Tech Hub grants for medical technology. So, I expect to see that to be a strong industry going forward for us as well.
Okay, Kristen, you had that housing affordability slide. The question coming in, why does it list 99,000 for medium household income? Seems every time I hear media for our area, it's usually lower than 99,000 for median income.
Yeah, that's the number that the Wells Fargo index uses. Generally, our median income has actually come up quite a bit, though, here in the region over the last few years. So some reports show it a little lower than that, but not too much of a gap between there compared to what we'd seen historically.
Kristen, you're popular. A couple of questions coming in regarding the sector analysis, and I think you had some of this. Do you have data on the level/types of jobs that are being added? Professional college, skilled trades, general laborers, and I believe there was some information on that slide. But any other things to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen kind of occupations across the varying levels come in. Like for the semiconductor industry, for example, you need kind of the semiconductor technicians. You also need the engineering the engineering degrees come in as well. I think that's actually, side note, where we're very fortunate with what ASU's done to grow their engineering college, as well as the programs that the Maricopa Community Colleges have put in place that allows us to continue to attract those occupations here. But really, when we're talking about these industries, what we're seeing is kind of a top to bottom, entry level to the more skilled needing to fill these industries.
Doug, what drives housing affordability, and what can we do to improve affordable housing?
Well, I think maybe more surprisingly, with the interest rate increases that we saw over the last 2 years, that had we didn't see the price maybe adjustments that we might have expected in the average housing cost. I think there was some anticipation that with the rate hikes that there would be some readjustments in the housing costs that we didn't see. So I think that's been a sticking point where homeowners are locked into interest rates that are much lower than current rates. So if we did see the interest rates start to come down, I think homeowners would be more willing to sell and add to the supply of houses that are available. Prior to that, I think we've seen a large increase in the population into the state, but then I also think that we're at a unique point in time where we're seeing kind of some generational impacts into housing as well, where we're seeing with the lowering of the unemployment rate, increase of jobs, millennials finally being able to afford their own homes and looking for housing. Baby boomers, I think, are staying in their houses longer. And then we're also seeing the next generation, come out, being able to be hired as well and looking for jobs. So I think there was a lot of demand due to some of the employment success more recently that has led to increases in the housing market as well, housing pricing.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Okay, a few more minutes left. As we wrap up this call, we're going to give everybody an opportunity to kind of get some closing thoughts, and well over 300 attendees for this call. Fantastic turnout. And for those of us on this call that I would say are not economists, and maybe a lot of data, a lot of information thrown at us today, a lot of charts. For those of us who have maybe a minimal understanding of inflation, CPI, Nicole, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to put you on the spot here. A lot of optimism, it seemed like, from this call today and from what we saw. But when we're having those discussions at the dinner table, out in social settings, and someone, throws a random comment out about the economy, what's a good way to, explain what we saw here today to our circles, to whether that's our family or our friends? And I'll start with you on the national scale, and then we can kind of move down the line here on what it means for Arizona.
Yeah, so I'll take it in two pieces. So I think the way at the dinner table that I would explain the past year has been, so 2023, I would say it's been exceptionally resilient. And then I think going into 2024, we're looking at some uncharted territory, and I think uncertainty is going to be even more elevated going into 2024. So even if the economy, does avoid a recession, we look for pretty sluggish economic growth. So it's not going to be good times essentially in 2024 because we're coming out of this exuberance in 2023. So that's what I would say.
Okay. Doug, same question, and maybe you can localize it a little more here for Arizona when you're having those discussions in social circles.
Yeah, and for Arizona, I think we benefit from an inflow of individuals into the state. We see a lot of in-migration from other states, and Arizona has benefited tremendously. It's not individuals just coming here to retire, but it's individuals coming here with their skills, ready to work, ready with their ideas. And so I think that has made Arizona more resilient, more suited to defend against some of these unknown challenges, as they come in the years to come.
Fantastic. Okay, Kristen, I'll let you wrap us up here. We've heard resiliency. We've had a lot of information discussed today. So how would you describe, to social circles, those you work with? Oh, you work at GPEC. What's going on with our economy? How would you describe that?
It's a lot like what Doug said, how Greater Phoenix goes, Arizona goes, and kind of vice versa. And I think with the inflow of people, we'll continue to see our economy be a little bit stronger than the US. However, to Nicole's point, I do think we're going to see much more moderate growth than we've seen in the last few years. Maybe the term I keep hearing thrown around is that soft landing is kind of what I'm expecting to see here.
Well, thank you guys so much, Nicole, Doug, Kristen, for your insights, your information. We'd like to thank you for attending this installment of the Regional Report. We hope you found this discussion informative and valuable. We will, of course, be publishing a recording of this webinar and a blog recap to GPEC's social media channels, so keep an eye out for those if you'd like to revisit the information. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning, and we'll see you next time.